There is a people in South Sudan whose average height would make them stand out in a room of professional basketball players, and whose most famous sons actually did. Manute Bol stood 7 feet 6 inches tall and became one of the most recognizable shot blockers in NBA history. His son, Bol Bol, plays in the league today. Luol Deng built a 15-year NBA career and later became president of South Sudan's own basketball federation. Manute Bol's own family history captures the extremity of this trait particularly well. He was reportedly recruited to basketball almost by accident, discovered as a teenager, already standing well over 7 feet tall, despite no formal athletic training at all, a size that in most parts of the world would have been treated as a medical anomaly rather than simply an unusually tall member of an unusually tall community. That distinction matters. What looks statistically extraordinary elsewhere in the world barely registers as unusual within Dinka communities themselves. A difference in baseline expectation that itself hints at how deeply this trait runs through the population, rather than surfacing only in rare individual cases. All three trace their roots to the same people, the Dinka, the largest ethnic group in South Sudan, and by most measurements, the tallest population on Earth. For decades, scientists have tried to explain exactly why, and the honest answer is that they've only partially succeeded, because the deeper they look, the stranger the Dinka genome turns out to be. The basic numbers alone are startling. Surveys conducted by researchers Roberts and Bainbridge in the early 1950s measured Dinka men averaging 182.6 centimeters, just under 6 feet, with Dinka women commonly reaching 172 to 178 centimeters, 5'8" to 5'10", taller than the average adult man in dozens of countries today. More recent measurements have found subgroups averaging even higher, with individual men regularly exceeding 6'6" and documented cases surpassing 7 feet. The Dinka belong to a broader group called the Nilotic peoples, which also includes the Nuer and Shilluk, all traditionally cattle-herding pastoralists living along the Nile River basin in South Sudan, and all sharing this same unusually tall, slender body type. Population geneticist Sarah Tishkoff's landmark autosomal study of African genetic diversity found that Nilotic groups form a genuinely distinct genetic cluster, separated from other sub-Saharan African populations in ways that show up clearly in the DNA itself, not just in outward appearance. Given numbers this extreme and a genetic signature distinct enough to register clearly in population-wide studies, the obvious question is whether this is really about DNA at all, or whether it's simply what happens when a cattle-herding people eats a certain kind of diet in a certain kind of climate for generations. That's not an unreasonable doubt. Height is famously sensitive to nutrition and childhood health, and plenty of populations have grown taller or shorter across a single generation purely from changes in food security, with no genetic shift required at all. Before we get to the answer, it's worth sitting with how difficult this question actually is to settle cleanly. Diet, disease burden, and genetics all push height in the same direction or the opposite direction depending on circumstances, and untangling which factor is doing how much work requires exactly the kind of natural experiment that researchers almost never get handed by accident. In this case, they got one anyway. Researchers studying Nilotic refugee populations in East African camps found something that cut straight through the noise. Dinka and Nuer men measured significantly taller than Anuak and Shilluk men living in the exact same refugee camp, eating the exact same food, under the exact same environmental conditions. When every external variable is held identical and a height gap this consistent still shows up between closely related populations, that's not a diet story anymore. That's inherited biology asserting itself regardless of circumstance, and it's about as close to a controlled experiment as human population genetics ever gets outside a laboratory. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. If genetics really does explain a meaningful part of this height difference, what is it actually doing at the biological level? Part of the answer involves body proportion rather than height alone. Nilotic populations show what anthropologists describe as an extremely linear, narrow body build, long limbs, especially long forearms and lower legs relative to torso length, a pattern consistent with what's sometimes called Allen's rule, the biological principle that populations adapted to hot climates tend to develop longer, leaner limbs, because a higher surface area to volume ratio helps the body shed heat more efficiently. Genetic association studies have also identified variants in growth-related genes, including regions near HMGA2, a gene repeatedly linked to height variation in populations worldwide, showing elevated frequency in nilotic samples, though researchers are careful to note that height is a genuinely complex trait shaped by dozens or hundreds of small genetic contributions working together rather than any single gene acting alone. If a mystery like this, one where science has real evidence but still can't close the loop completely, is the kind of thing that keeps you curious, that's exactly why it's worth sticking around and subscribing, because the next layer of this particular story gets even stranger than the height question itself. And if you've got a population whose biology seems to defy a simple explanation, tell us in the comments, because those are exactly the cases this channel wants to dig into next. It's worth adding a note about where the Dinka's height ranks globally, because the comparison itself tells its own story. The Netherlands currently holds the title for tallest average national population, with Dutch men averaging close to 6 feet. Field studies of Dinka subgroups have repeatedly measured averages meeting or exceeding that mark, and unlike the Netherlands, where average height climbed steadily over the 20th century alongside rising living standards and nutrition, the Dinka were already being measured at this range in the 1950s, under far more difficult economic and environmental conditions than a modern European nation. That detail matters, because it suggests the underlying genetic ceiling for Dinka height may sit even higher than the recorded averages, if nutrition and childhood health were ever to fully catch up to what has historically been available in wealthier nations. Researchers who conducted the original refugee camp measurements noted exactly this possibility themselves, writing that nilotic populations could likely attain even greater height under more favorable conditions during early development, meaning the numbers already on record may understate the full genetic potential rather than overstate it. It's worth pausing on the cultural weight cattle carry in Dinka society, because it helps explain why the missing lactase gene is such a strange puzzle rather than a minor dietary footnote. Cattle in Dinka culture function as far more than a food source. They are central to marriage negotiations, paid as bride wealth in numbers that can run into the dozens of animals for a single union, and individual cattle are frequently given personal names, celebrated in songs, and treated as extensions of a family's identity and social standing. Young Dinka men traditionally compose personal songs praising their favorite ox, incorporating its color, horn shape, and temperament into verses performed at community gatherings, a practice anthropologists have documented extensively as one of the clearest expressions of the deep, non-purely nutritional bond between Dinka identity and cattle herding. Milk itself carries this same cultural weight, consumed daily, offered to guests as a mark of hospitality, and treated as a dietary staple in a way that has almost certainly remained consistent for many centuries, if not longer. A population this thoroughly organized around a single food source is exactly the kind of population evolutionary biologists would expect to show strong selective pressure toward digesting that food efficiently, which is precisely why its genetic absence here reads as such a significant anomaly rather than an incidental detail. There's also a broader regional pattern worth noting, because the Dinka's situation isn't quite as isolated as it might first appear. Genetic surveys across Sudan and South Sudan have found that several other Nilo-Saharan-speaking pastoralist groups in the region show this same near-total absence of lactase persistence alleles, while neighboring Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations, including Beja pastoralists and various Arab groups in the same general region, show meaningfully higher frequencies of the trait. That regional split suggests the answer may have less to do with any individual population's specific history and more to do with a broader evolutionary pattern separating Nilo-Saharan-speaking peoples from their Afro-Asiatic-speaking neighbors, a linguistic and genetic boundary that, for reasons still not fully understood, appears to have shaped which populations picked up this particular adaptation and which ones simply learned to live without it. Because here is where the Dinka genome does something genuinely puzzling, something that has nothing to do with height at all. The Dinka, Nuer, and Shilluk are cattle people in the deepest sense. Their entire traditional economy, diet, and cultural identity built around herds that provide milk as a primary daily food source, generation after generation, for thousands of years. Nearly every human population around the world that has depended on milk this heavily for this long has evolved some version of lactase persistence, a genetic mutation that keeps the enzyme lactase active into adulthood, allowing people to digest milk sugar without discomfort. Multiple independent genetic studies, going back to research by Bayumi and colleagues in the early 1980s, and confirmed repeatedly since, including a detailed 2020 survey of Sudanese and South Sudanese populations, have found that the Dinka, Nuer, and Shilluk carry essentially none of the known lactase persistence gene variants. Not a low frequency, functionally zero. That result should mean these populations are lactose intolerant as adults, unable to properly digest fresh milk, and yet milk remains central to their diet and culture today, exactly as it has for generations. Scientists studying this contradiction don't have a settled answer yet. Leading hypotheses include the possibility that traditional preparation methods, fermenting milk into forms with reduced lactose content, soften the impact enough to make regular consumption tolerable, or that something in the gut microbiome itself, bacteria capable of processing lactose through a different biological pathway entirely, might be doing work the human genome alone isn't equipped to do. Neither explanation has been conclusively proven. As of the most recent published research, this remains a genuine open question. A population whose entire way of life depends on a food source their own DNA appears unprepared to handle, still functioning anyway, through some mechanism nobody has fully identified. What ties both of these threads together, the height and the missing lactase gene, is that they point toward the same underlying story. The Dinka genome carries clear, measurable evidence of biological adaptation under extreme pressure, shaped by one of the hottest, most demanding pastoralist environments on Earth. And yet even now, with modern sequencing technology available, science can describe what's happening far more confidently than it can explain exactly how or why every piece of it works. The refugee camp study proved height has real genetic roots. The lactase research proves something about milk digestion that shouldn't work, working anyway. Between those two findings sits a population whose biology keeps outrunning the explanations built to describe it, tall enough to reshape professional basketball on another continent, and still carrying at least one genetic mystery modern science hasn't managed to close. And that, in the end, might be the most honest thing this channel can say about the Dinka. Not that their DNA has finally been decoded, but that it has been read closely enough to reveal exactly how much is still unread, a population whose bodies keep asking questions their own genome hasn't finished answering.